The Washington budget battle, a focus of SIFMA's annual meeting in New York City. Joining me now is one of the speakers, Senator Mike Crapo, and it's very good to talk to you once again.
My privilege.
And you've been talking quite a bit about what needs to happen with this super committee as the deadline fast approaches. You favor a more aggressive approach to budget cutting in the area of $4 trillion.
Yes.
What's the appetite among the super committee members to be aggressive?
I believe that there is a good appetite among them. In other words, I think on both sides of the aisle in that committee, there are members who want to get to a bigger deal, a $4 trillion or more dollar solution. And but I also believe they're facing the brutal politics that the Gang of Six faced and that others have faced who have tried to do this, and that is to find the pathway where you can actually build a bigger plan that can get the political support in both caucuses. I personally think that you can get that political support more easily with a big plan than with a small plan.
Now, why is that? Because it would sound like that's harder to do on face value.
Well, a small plan like 1.2 trillion, which is their minimum, you can pretty much achieve that in any number of ways. It's not that hard. And you can do it without getting into all of the political dynamics that are required for a bigger plan. But it also doesn't solve the problem. In terms of solving the problem, I think it's easier to do it with one big plan where you can make the compromises between the different competing interests in one big negotiation rather than having to deal with it one step at a time. In other words, what I'm really saying is if you do 1.2 trillion, you don't solve it. You're going to have to do that 4 or 5 or 6 times. And I think that is destined to much more political difficulty than just putting it all together and negotiating the final solution.
Can you tell us inside the Beltway, how much of a threat is the ratings downgrade, potential further ratings downgrades, either by S&P or some of the other rating agencies? Is this something that Congress is taking seriously right now as they approach this deadline?
I think so, but it's one of those things where that awareness and understanding is growing. And frankly, I don't think that an understanding of how serious that threat is has gotten far enough and deep enough into the heart of Congress to be as big a factor as it should be. But it is increasingly a bigger and bigger factor.
There are a lot of items on the table. You spoke about some of them today: entitlement reform, tax reform. What is the one item that there might be some movement or agreement on? Could tax reform be the first tough issue that's tackled?
Well, I don't think so, and that's a very good example to illustrate my previous answer. I don't think we could do tax reform on its own, because there has to be a quid quo pro in order to get the concessions from all sides to do the things that we need to do in tax reform. There has to be some negotiation and some give and take in other parts of the budget. And so, for example, I think you could do tax reform and entitlement reform together much more easily than either could be done separately.
On the revenue side, do you think that Republicans would agree to any sort of tax increase, and would a financial transaction tax be dead on arrival?
I don't think a financial transaction tax will go anywhere in this Congress. With regard to the broader question of whether we are going to be able to see Republican support for a revenue piece, I think the answer is yes, but it depends on what that revenue piece is. And what I'm really focusing on here is I think there's still a very strong opposition in Republican ranks to just raising tax rates. But there's a very big willingness to reform the tax code, flatten the code, and expand the base, and actually lower the rates, but increase the revenue to the federal government. And that kind of very powerful tax reform is something that I think Republicans would be very warm to.
Do you think the super committee reaches its deadline?
I think it will, but it'll have to reach its deadline.
Well, if it doesn't, they'll be across the board.
Yeah, that's true. I think that they will. What I'm not sure of is whether they'll get much beyond the minimum, the 1.2 trillion. I'm hoping and encouraging them to get to the 4 trillion, but I do believe they will meet their deadline.
Senator Mike Crapo, good to talk to you once again. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.